Hello, everyone. My name is Justin Steinberg. I'm a professor of medieval Italian literature in the Department of Romance Languages and Literature. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the inaugural lecture of the Virgilio Lecture Series. First off, I want to thank the generosity of the Virgilio Foundation for providing the generous funding for the series, which allows us to invite a prominent intellectual artist from Italy each year to give a series of 3 lectures and collaborate with our undergraduate and graduate programs. This is a very exciting opportunity, and we're truly grateful for the support. Our first ever speaker for this lecture series is our guest today, Adriana Cavarero. Adriana Cavarero is a professor of political philosophy at the Università di Studi di Verona. She's one of the most important figures in contemporary philosophy, renowned in the fields of feminist studies and political theory. Cavarero is also an expert in classical thought, which she has read and reinterpreted from a feminist perspective. And she's conducted several studies on narrative, speech, and political discourse, as well as on violence and the voice. Her latest books, at least the ones translated in English, include Surging Democracy, Notes on Hannah Arendt's Political Thought. This is Stanford University Press, 2021. Inclinations, A Critique of Rectitude, also with Stanford, 2016. Horrorism, Naming Contemporary Violence, Columbia University Press, 2008. And For More Than One Voice, Towards a Philosophy of Vocal Expression, a very influential work, Stanford, 2005. On a personal note, I will just add that when we were deliberating on who should inaugurate this lecture series, the advisory committee immediately proposed the name of Professor Cavarero, and we were delighted when she accepted. Professor Cavarero was our first choice for several reasons. First, her work is authentically interdisciplinary and is of interest to scholars and intellectuals from many fields, and I think is a testament to the breadth of her scholarship. I see here today colleagues from a variety of departments: Romance Languages and Literature, Classics, Gender Studies, and Philosophy. Second, her work is theoretically bold, original, and I would say also outward-facing, but also rigorous, historicist, and humanistic in the best Italian tradition. This combination of theory and philology exemplifies a form of scholarship that I think has also found fertile ground at the University of Chicago. Third, and relatedly, Professor Cavarero is no stranger to the University of Chicago. She has enriched our campus community on previous visits, and she has many friends and interlocutors here, including Armando Maggi, Martha Feldman, Eric Santner, Sarah Nuder, Alessia Ricciardi from Northwestern, and many others. Perhaps most importantly, our graduate students love her work. There will surely be a new generation of Cavareriani, or maybe Cavarerians. I wasn't sure what to write, but it seems almost certain. Before I finish introduction, just on a technical note, for those of you who are following along on the Zoom, if you have questions, please write them in the chat, and I will ask them in the generous question and answer session we'll have afterwards. Perhaps keep the questions short-ish, if possible. Okay, so the title of this year's lecture series, the first ever Virgilio Lecture Series, is Women and Monsters: The Uncanny of Maternity in Literary Imagination. The title of the talk today is Singing with the Sirens: Voices of the Mediterranean Myth. Please join me in welcoming back our friend and colleague, Adriana Cavarero.
Thank you very much to Justin Steinberg who invited me, and it is for me a great honor, so I thank you, the Virgilio Foundation. And you can imagine what it means for me to be the person to inaugurate this, I hope, great tradition. And let me begin with quoting Italy. which I'm supposed to represent. Italy is a peninsula, but I like to think of it as a great bridge connecting the culture of continental Europe to the culture of the Mediterranean Sea. I was born in Piedmont and I live in Veneto, in the north. However, I confess that I have a special inclination for the culture of the Southern Sea, where Greek civilization gave way to the Latin, where Virgil's musical language was born and flourished. To tell the truth, Virgil was born in North Italy, near Mantua, very close to Verona. His poems, however, sing the melodious song of the language of Rome, whose music spread along on shore of the Mediterranean Sea, echoing the ancient chant of the sirens. The Virgilio lectures, which I have the honor to inaugurate, I will dedicate precisely to the musicality that resonates in his poetic language, Latin. By this, I do not mean to say that I will discuss Virgil's work, as I'm not a Latin scholar, and I would not be capable of it. I would be ridiculous. Instead, I mean to dedicate my first lecture to exalting the vocal component, the singing voice, the sound materiality that resonates in Latin as well as in every language. I will do this through a myth of Mediterranean culture, the famous myth of the sirens. According to Virgil, as we read in the Georgics, one of these sirens was named Parsinope, and she sang near the Cape of Palinuro, a beautiful place. In my second lecture, I will explore the ancient myths imaginary on the theme of motherhood, and then in my last lecture, move on to visit the same theme, motherhood, in the writing of a contemporary Italian novelist, Elena Ferrante. My hope is to captivate you in a narrative that tells of extraordinary female voices and disturbing female bodies. Together, if you will be so patient enough to follow the hidden plot of my talks, we will delve into the ancient and modern imaginary that frames formidable female power in a context of women and monster. Today, we begin with the monster, the sirens. Among the theriomorphic, monstrous female figures inhabiting ancient myths, the sirens stand out and still capture our imagination. Homer places them on an island in the sea near Sicily, close to what we now call the Strait of Messina. Despite a long tradition transforming sirens into creatures that are half woman and half fish, in Homer's account, they did not have a fish-like body, but rather a bird-like one. Of course, this is not surprising, given that, like birds, sirens are skilled at modulating their voices and singing, while fish are mute animals. Today, I will speak about this enchanting, irresistible, melodious voice that lies at the heart of the siren's myth and has made them immortal. However, I want to make a brief clarification first. Indeed, like fish, sirens have a close relationship with water, not only because they live on the shores of an island surrounded by the sea, but also because, according to mythological tradition, their father is Akelu, a river god, and the son of Okeanos, the ocean. The mother of the siren is instead the muse Melopeme, from whom they inherited the ability to sing melodic songs. Tellingly, as you can perceive, the name Melopeme resonates with the etymological root of words like melodious and melody. In fact, It is this maternal inheritance centered on vocalization, this extraordinary power linked to singing that characterizes the mythical icon of the sirens and make their story unforgettable. In other words, if there is an essential meaning that encompasses and organizes the sense of the timeless myth of the sirens, it concerns the voice, and more precisely the voice of singing. Without losing sight of the liquid element that surrounds the sirens, a kind of amniotic fluid that further binds them to the maternal figure, I will therefore focus on the theme of the voice. It is a theme to which I have dedicated a significant part of my research in the last 20 years, and one that still surprises me for its ability to subvert philosophical canons, and more broadly, to contrast the tendency of philosophy to focus on the necessarily abstract semantic component of language at the expense of its material and corporeal vocal component. As Hannah Arendt points out, in acting and speaking, human beings show who they are, reveal actively their unique personal identities, and thus make their appearance in the human world, while their physical identities appear without any activity of their own in the unique shape of the body and the sound of the voice. This quote from Hannah Arendt helps me in briefly clarifying some important points of my approach to the topic of the voice. As Arendt remarks, the voice reveals the uniqueness of the one who emits it, reveals it immediately, without any activity of our own. In other words, the voice is unique and it expresses sonorously, physically, materially that embodied uniqueness that every human being is. We are not a multitude, let alone a mass of identical individuals. We are a plurality in which everybody is different from all those who live, have lived, and will live. Every time we open our mouths to speak, or to shout, or to sing, the sound emitted by our throats expresses this uniqueness and this plurality. In this sense, the voice radically resists homologation, and even that homologating abstract frame which philosophy calls universality. Whatever your voice says, proclaims, asserts, shouts, whatever content it communicates first and foremost your uniqueness and plurality. It is a primary communication in which the speaker, even before communicating something, communicates his or her corporeal uniqueness made of throat, larynx, lungs, body, pulsating life, singular existence. Interesting enough, as I try to argue in my book For More Than One Voice, the philosophical tradition has persistently managed to ignore this vocal communication of human uniqueness. By sacrificing voice to logos, the sonority of bodies to the semantic realm of thought, philosophy has focused on what and how the speaker communicates to the detriment of who he or she vocally communicates. As a consequence, as you allow me to put it a bit abruptly, the entire history of philosophy is the history of the devocalization of logos. The famous logocentrism is the product of an erasure of the vocal sphere. The universality philosophy aspired to is grounded in the obliteration of voices and therefore of the plural embodied uniqueness that vocality as such entails. I have mentioned logocentrism, but of course, for the sake of precision, I could have said phallologocentrism. The act by which the philosophical tradition removes the voice from the logos realm coincides in fact with the exclusive assignment of this realm to the male gender and the assignment of the vocal, bodily, carnal sphere to the female gender. As the mythical figure of the sirens shows, there is an original link between the female body and song, between vocal performance and the woman's truth. More or less, according to the Western imaginary, women and voice are together in a material domain of vocal bodies that the logos feels as threatening, but attractive, dangerous, but almost irresistible, indeed a trap for the pleasure of hearing that the rational subject can hardly keep under control. Philosophy does fear emotions. Where the reality of plural embodied uniqueness unfolds through voices, there lurks not only pleasure, but a whole range of emotions that challenge the icy enclosure of rationality which the traditional male subject is fond of. The phonosphere, the sphere of the voice, is an intense emotional sphere. The voice is rarely impassive, neutral, and when it is, it sounds artificial, false. The voice can express and communicate joy, pleasure, surprise, disdain, grief, lament, loneliness, and a range of other positive or negative emotions. There is, however, a distinct and special pleasure inherent in the voice itself that is worth a specific investigation. It deals with the very act of uttering sounds, with the enjoyment of one's own vocality as bodily expression of vitality. Significantly, such a vitality, the simple fact of living, is already manifest in the very act of breathing, an involuntary act that goes largely unnoticed, automatic, unperceived by the one who breathes. The voice is a sonization of this breath, now intentional, perceived, turned into pleasure of vocal emission. Needless to say that this kind of pleasure is at its greatest in the case of singing. As Konstantinos Tomaidis, one of the most innovative scholars in the field of the voice studies, justly observes, compared to speaking, singing is post-linguistic. It fosters a desired, cultivated, and profitable vocal excess. Plato is aware of the supreme pleasure of this vocal excess, and symptomatically, in the midst of the cicadas, he warns philosophers against indulging in it. We read in the Phaedrus that cicadas were once not insects, but men, so overcome with pleasure, the Greek is odones, very strong, so overcome with pleasure of singing that they sang and sang, forgetting food and drink until they died. Thus, according to Plato, so absolute is the pleasure of singing that it is incompatible with human life. Fortunately, the Italian novelist Italo Calvino devotes a different narrative to the subject. In a short and wonderful story, it recounts of a king who, seated on his throne, happened to listen to a female voice singing far away. The king, writes Calvino, is attracted by that voice, as it offers itself in song. What mainly attracts him is the pleasure this voice puts into existing as voice. But this pleasure leads the king to imagine how this person might be different from every other person, as the voice is different. In other words, not only the king discovers that embodied uniqueness of each human being as it gets manifested in the uniqueness of the voice, but he also discovers that there is a distinctive pleasure in singing, and enjoying the sonorous vibration of a strut of flesh. Calvino's text is worth quoting not only because it pointedly contrasts the strategical hostility of philosophy toward the voice, but because it also distinguishes the pleasure of the listener from the pleasure of the singer. In my opinion, this is a truly crucial distinction, which, when applied to the myth of the siren and to the various modern interpretations of this myth, leads to some surprising results. Although Homer makes the sirens into omniscient creatures who stand out as extraordinary narrators, his emphasis emblematically goes to their singing power and the attractive and deadly effect of their melodious voice. In other words, already in Homer, the sirens are described from the perspective of the listener, whether this be Odysseus, Ulysses, who managed to enjoy the song without succumbing, or whether this be the various sailors who, attracted by the irresistible voice of the sirens, have gone to their deaths on the island's rocks. Tellingly, also in Theodor Adorno's version of the myth, as we read in his renowned book, Dialectic of Enlightenment, the fulcrum of the tale is Odysseus' ear. Once again, the attention goes to the one who listens and feels immense pleasure in listening, while nothing is said about the pleasure the sirens themselves feel in singing. It is, moreover, precisely Odysseus' ear, according to Adorno, the archetype of the Western subject, that judges them as irresistible little enchanters. In both Homer and Adorno, as in most traditional readings of the myth, sirens are thus given the role of the object with respect to the subject, that is, the role of the vocal source who causes acoustic pleasure with respect to the receiver who enjoys it and whose delight organizes the myth's soundscape and plot. At first sight, Franz Kafka's reinterpretation of the myth in his famous short essay, The Silence of the Sirens, seemed to be an exception. Kafka recounts that the sirens decided not to sing, to stay mute, in order to mock Odysseus, who, tied to the ship's mast and with his ears wide open, waited in vain for acoustic enjoyment. Thus, Kafka at least grants a certain subjectivity to the sirens. Yet, even in Kafka's very original version of the story, the sirens are denied the pleasure of singing. They decide to remain silent, literally mute, as if their pleasure had to be sacrificed to their acquisition of subjectivity. Briefly told, our version of the myth avoid thematizing the siren's pleasure in emitting a flow of sound that modulates like a song, their enjoyment in making their larynx vibrate, feeling it vibrate, transforming their vital breath into melody. If the myths were recounted from the perspective of the sirens, however, it would be precisely this pleasure that would come to the fore. We could then describe the siren as creatures who excel in enjoying the bodily emotion of emitting a voice and thus expressing materially, physically, sonorously their uniqueness and plurality. Like other women in myth who act in groups, the Bacchae, the Eumenides, Homer's sirens do not sing in isolation, but in groups. Their performance is a choral performance. We can imagine how much pleasure the siren takes take in participating in a choral song that, while uniting their singular voices, does not blend them into a single voice, but leaves them plural. That is, leave each siren's unique voice remain distinct while vibrating in the polyphony. After all, anyone who has sung in a choir has had this experience. I had it. As it is useful to point out again, I'm speaking of the experience of the subject who emits the voice, not the acoustic experience of the listener. Truly, what matters most in my current reinterpretation of the myths is that the sirens, the vocal performers, occupy the position of the subject, and in the emblematic case of singing in a choir, occupy the position of the subject both as singers and as reciprocal listeners to each other's voices. In the polyphonic performance, singers hear each other's voice and they modulate each own vocalization in order to achieve a relation both auditory and vocal. It is a relationality made up of bodily proximity, auditory range, coordinated vocal emissions. That is, it is a relationality made up of and dependent on physical sonorous notes, a vocal auditory net exerting bodily uniqueness and plurality. The pleasure of emitting sounds from a throat of flesh goes together with the pleasure of being a vocal embodied plurality which consists of unique voices. This is why, in order to stress this vocal plurality, I should prefer the neologism pluriphony to the term polyphony. Namely, the term pluriphony helps me in putting an explicit emphasis on the plurality of voices, and more specifically on the soundscape they originate and delectate in. A stake in this pluriphonic performance, which consists of the vocal acoustic enjoyment of plurality, in fact, is a sort of erotics. Significantly enough, it is an erotics that perfectly contrasts the usual eroticization of the sirens as object of the male sexual desire. In my version of the tale, definitely, the sirens don't sing to attract sailors and make them die of pleasure. They sing for their own pleasure, for the thrill of taking their singing experience to the limit of the enjoyable, beyond the meaning of the words they utter, and even beyond the music of the language that reverberates in their song. Notoriously, after Homer, this plot of the tale changed, and crucially the sirens, little by little, lost all speech. In the imaginary of later tradition, mermaids continued to sing, but gradually lose the power to narrate and even articulate words. Deprived of speech, they tend more and more to become pure voice, inarticulated song, acoustic vibration, music of a lost language. They become sinuous, fish-like creature, something that the Homeric bird-like creature never were, who seduce men not only through their song, but also by their beautiful, sinuous, iridescent body. The story of this metamorphosis therefore ends up confirming the audiocentric orientation on which the myth is built from the outset. The figure of sirens occupies the position of the object, and more precisely, that of a sexual female body attracting the male ear and gaze. There is undoubtedly something fascinating in the myth of the sirens. With regard to the theme of vocality, however, there is also something extreme, excessive, perhaps even misleading. At the very least, I am aware that my emphasis on the pleasure of singing, which would find a definitive example in the sirens, risks overshadowing the much broader and more varied phenomenology of the voice, a phenomenology that concerns every human being as a living being with a voice. To play on Aristotle's famous rational animal, I could have said every human being as a vocal animal. And you know how the animal, the Greek zoon, is at the corporeal realm of life, at the general flow of zoe, of life. What interests me, however, now is to point out that while fully exalted in singing, the emotional power of the voice refers to a wider range of vocal emissions, from articulated speech to pure cry or shouting, of which singing is only one, although very intriguing case. In this regard, allow me to open a digression that which seemingly takes us away from the myth of the sirens for a while, but in the end will prove useful in rereading this myth in depth. Recently, I have addressed my research, or rather, I have opened my ear to the vocal performance of the so-called political square of our time. Square where, as Judith Butler, one of the most prestigious contemporary American philosophers, would say, people gather and body assemble to demonstrate or protest, parading or occupying a public space. As a matter of fact, there is a distinctive soundscape in this participatory and not violent experience of movement and protest that Butler counts as example of radical democracy, and that I prefer to trace back to the concept of surging democracy. To say the least, while the general idea of democracy, based essentially on the ancient Greek model, is usually associated with the sound of political speeches, the phenomenology of political square, which embodied the nascent generative moment of a surging democracy, is instead characterized by a much more varied and complex soundscape that mixes voicing of words, chants, shouting, and other vocal emissions that might also seem cacophonic, but are in fact exemplary pluriphonic. In truth, there are different soundscapes of the political squares where body gather produce different and distinctive phonospheres. In particular, among these different vocal performances, it is important, in my opinion, to distinguish the phonosphere typical of the masses, well represented by the fascist crowd shouting in unison, from the phonosphere that refers instead to a plurality of political actors, equal but distinct, who interact in the incipient phase of that distinctive political scenario which I give the name of surging democracy. For instance, while the voice of the masses manifests itself often with a thunderous sound which expresses the maximum degree of fusion of individuals into a compact crowd, into one collective body, the voice of plurality manifests itself instead in a perceivable pluriphony. In other words, the soundscape of the so-called choreographed masses who simultaneously move and shout out and sing as one body, so dear to the Nazi and fascist aesthetics, relates to a political phonosphere which is completely different from the pluriphonic soundscape produced by bodies who gather in a public space to democratically and peacefully demonstrate and protest. At stake in this pluriphony dealing with the experience of a democracy in the making, that is with a surging nascent democracy, is the sound of plural delectation within the very act of participating and sharing in a vocal emission that exalts the performance uniqueness together with their bodily, physical, audible relationality. As if it were a musical democracy in which plurivocality turns into a delighting political performance. Indeed, it is an erotics of a specific kind, a political erotics made up of voices that vibrate and take pleasure in resonating with each other while expressing that distinctive political emotion which Hannah Arendt calls public happiness. If you allow me to be autobiographical, I must confess that I have an ear quite sensitive to the voice of plurality. When I hear it in squares where feminists or other protesters gather and demonstrate peacefully. Yes, I delectate in vocal plurality and share the thrill, gladly participating in the political erotics that vocal plurality sometimes engenders. Emotions are uncontrollable, but the pleasure of participating in pluriphonic political interaction rings with its own distinctive tone. As if the pleasure the sirens felt in singing somehow resonates in our throats and delights our ears when our voices happen to express the public happiness of an embodied plurality savoring the taste of freedom in interaction. Yet, although it may explain a great deal about the pleasure of pluriphony and its power to counteract the dominance of the phallogocentric and belligerent subject, that of the siren is not a political myth, clearly. Rather, it is the staging of a perfect choral performance by prodigious monstrous creature on the threshold between human and animal that symbolizes the transcendental beauty of the vocal universe as such. After all, maybe there is something true in the traditional version of the myth that focuses on the listener's fate of death. No living human being has ever really heard the song of the sirens. In its absolute perfection, which we can only imagine and of which we can scarcely fabulate, such a song is in fact humanly inaudible, as well as, of course, unperformable and inimitable. As if the sirens' chant were the song of all songs, the unattainable vocal performance of all vocal performance, the pleasure of vocality itself projected into the mythical time of an ultimate pluriphony whose original soundtrack occasionally nurtures our vocal and oral delight in sonically revealing our being unique and plural. I want to suggest in conclusion that the sirens belong a transcendental world beyond our reach. We can only imagine them, and sometimes when we happen to vocalize the fact of being plural and unique, recognizing our pleasure and the distant and thrilling echo of their singing pleasure. It is indeed a sort of erotics, sometimes a special and generative political erotics, inherent in the vocal relationality which characterizes the human condition as a condition of vocal plural bodies. As if in the contingency and impermanence of this pluriphony, there was a collective public happiness, a democratic thrill, as if singing together were the main expression, the pleasurable communication of our being unique and plural bodies. So, in the end, then we understand why musical tradition claims that sirens were born from the muse Melopimene, the melodious. The highlighting of corporeity that lies at the center of the maternal scene, a scene on which female bodies generate other bodies, is not only given in the mythical birth of the sirens as mere body, but also and simultaneously as a vocal body, a body whose joy of being unique and plural is expressed in song. In this sense, Melopemene, the siren's mother, embodies the melody of being alive, as if the first breath of each new creature, real or mythical, were a song, or as if we, fragile human beings, remembering the myth of the sirens, could rekindle the corporeal bond with the mother from whom we were born through the primary melody of a song. In a very famous verse, the American poet Thomas Eliot says, "I have heard mermaids singing each other. I do not think that they will sing to me." Whatever it may mean, and whatever is nostalgia for the Homeric heroes bygone times, I think Eliot is right. The sirens do not sing to him, just as they did not sing to Ulysses. Neither they sing to us. They sing to themselves, for their vocal pleasure, for the gratitude of being born and being alive. Whenever we sing, it is perhaps this primordial gratitude to resonate in our vocal body when we sing and if we sing. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this rich and moving talk. We have some time for questions. Anyone want to start? Sarah? Thank you.
Hey. Hello. I had so many thoughts as you were speaking, and I guess I'm going to just ask about two classical thoughts. And one was in the Odyssey. I wondered if you had thought about Circe and Calypso and how they sing just for themselves. And they're both eavesdropped on, but they're clearly singing, they're alone. And so I wonder if they might be maybe better models of the subjectivity that you're looking for. And then my second question, which I'll just stick in there, I was really intrigued by the difference you were drawing between fascist expression of a crowd and then the democratic surge. And I thought about Plato, who you've sort of decimated very nicely. But it's Plato for whom the chorus is a kind of expression which looks fascist to me. That is, it speaks for the state, it makes you a good citizen, it controls your voice, whereas the thorobos, the roar of the crowd, is the bad thing. It's the democracy, it's the wave. And so I wonder how the chorus fits into these two visions. Thank you very much.
May I answer? Answer. Posso rispondere? Thank you very much for the question. I think that the first part of your question is sort of contribution, because it would be very interesting by rereading Homer and the Odyssey to distinguish different female voices who could be narrative. They are narrative voices, so it's very interesting. This. What is interesting, in my opinion, in the myth of the siren, is this centrality in Homer already, but in the tradition of the rewriting of the myth, this centrality of the pleasure of the listener. This was something I wanted to reflect, to ponder on. Why? all the soundscape of the myth is oriented and plotted on the centrality of the listen, the pleasure of the listen. So I was interested by this attempt to change, to turn on the perspective and reimagine the myth from the perspective of the pleasure of the singers. As for the second question, which is very interesting as well, of course, it's very difficult for me to answer because we would have a long section. Because as you know, Plato is not a friend of democracy. So it is difficult to describe democracy, also the Periclean democracy or the Greek democracy, from the perspective of Plato, because he is the first great enemy of democracy and is at the very beginning of a tradition of anti-democratic political thought. So it's difficult to really to focus on that.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. That was really interesting. So my first I have two questions. The first question is, once again, on the myth of the sirens and your point about the centrality of the pleasure of the listener. And in your addressing of the myth, it struck me that, to me, the sirens and Odysseus is somewhat reminiscent of the stories that we hear about narratives of sexual assault, that Odysseus is the man witnessing what these feminine figures are doing, and these feminine creatures are responsible for the pleasure they cause him. He's not responsible for that. And so there is this narrative that happens in which the female becomes monstrous because is responsible for his actions. And so I wonder if that is also an important aspect. The second question is about your figuring of peaceful protest, especially in your observation of feminist protest. And you describe it as a pluriphonic endeavor, which in a sort of musical action in concert analogy, it would seem that there is different people doing different things for the same end goal of, say, feminist action. However, as some scholars of social movements, for instance, point out, social movements are formed by people doing the same thing to different ends, not different things to the same end. And I wonder if that might, I don't know if challenge is the right word, but like how would that affect your interpretation of the square in the Butlerian version of it?
And thank you very much. Your first question is a question dealing with the problem of the patriarchal interpretation of the myth of the siren. Of course, the myth of the siren belonged to patriarchal tradition, but I didn't mention it because you cannot, think that there is something beyond the patriarchal tradition, and Homer is inside. But this doesn't mean that we don't have to read Homer. Homer is a genius, and so interpreting the patriarchal frame of the myth of the siren, we can go to various patriarchal interpretations, like that you mentioned, that they are responsible for the death of the siren. But this is a construction, of course. No? The second question is a very delicate question, because what I tried to do in my last book that was mentioned by Justin, Surge in Democracy, is to compare political squares, not by the point of view of the contents or the aim or the motivation of the people who gather, but from the point of view of the phenomenology of sounds, the phenomenology of the vocal. And this could be sort of my strange curiosity, which anyway I discovered I share with Judith Butler, because she writes in this book toward and come si chiama? Notes toward a theory of assembly. She says that when she participates in this protest in which the element of shouting or vocality is very important, she feels a thrill. And I feel the same thrill. And you can imagine, okay, you are a feminist, you participate in feminist protest, and you feel the thrill to be part of a community, which is true. But it's not as exactly the truth, because I am sensible to the vocal sphere, to the musical sphere. And I'm sensible too, very sensible, I'm emotional to the vocal sphere of the fascist mass. I have to combat, to contrast my emotional adhesion to the vocal manifestation of a crowd. So when there is a crowd shouting in unison or singing in unison, some, let's say, patriotic song, let's imagine the Marseillaise. Alors, enfants, there is an emotion in me, an acoustic emotion, which is independent from the contents. So I took my time for reflecting on the possibility of distinguishing this phenomenology of political soundscape. And in a way it is easy to distinguish crowded or protest from the point of view of the context. This is easier. But to distinguish it from the acoustical perspective, it is more difficult. And I think that one of the elements is the pluriphony. One of the elements is a sort of democratic music which is not aggressive, which manifests something like joy, and Arendt would say like public happiness, sort of the sound of freedom. I want to insist that this is typical of the incipient, the nascent moment of experiences democracy. Because I agree with Judith Butler that after this promising, incipient democratic moment, which I distinguish on the level of musicality, often what was going on, the outcome of this experience of public happiness often is very bad. Could result in totalitarian organization. So we have to be very, very careful when we are dealing with crowds, with protest. And one of the modality that seemed to me interesting was to perceive the differences in soundscapes. This is what I wanted to do.
Adriana, that was wonderful, and thank you so much. It's great to see you again. And
Yeah.
I'm a little daft. I have to be close to your voice.
I can also shout.
Yeah.
You know, I was quite struck that your project is partly a celebration of the voice, which I love. I celebrate the voice as well, but there's a dimension of kind of the imaginary and fantasy that is necessary to mobilize the project. That's part of how it's mobilized, it seems to me. And I don't say that in a negative way, but more in a sort of a way that just kind of invites us to reflect critically on what is implied in that and what's at stake in that. And one of the things I was thinking about was in this particular framing, your particular framing here was pretty explicitly the Mediterranean. I mean, you have, of course, made recourse to the Mediterranean in the past in very important ways, and partly by virtue of being a classicist. It's of necessity, but here it was not only explicit critically but and referentially, but autobiographically explicit. So I guess part of what I'm thinking about is how is that challenged in this moment in time? The Mediterranean is always an imaginary. It always has been. It's always been subject to contestation, to remaking, to transformation. Now it's challenged in ways that are political, as they have always been, but are also generated by current circumstance, migration by current circumstance, devastating fires and floods. And floods that are quite relevant to, you know, your imagining of the sirens and the sea, a place of hydropoetics that's now a hydropoetics in a kind of ruin, in part. And then, of course, there's AI, too, which challenges what the voice can be, its uniqueness. So, some thoughts.
Good. Yes, I agree with you. As a classicist and as a scholar fond for Greek mythology and Latin tradition and Virgil and Homer and all of these mythology staging in the Mediterranean Sea with the navigator, the sailors. I was struck and I was desperate. I've been desperate, I am desperate in the last decade. And the Mediterranean Sea, very, very close to the sirens location, is a cemetery now. People are dying, and so I'm trying to fabulate of a different tradition, a tradition in which not only Ulysses but in Aeneas and are migrants welcome by the Mediterranean shore. And this is sort of alternative dream, alternative fabulation to the terrible situation of our contemporary age. As an Italian living this tragedy of migration and people dying in the sea with the boat people. We are, as Italian, we are very affected by this tragedy, by this scenario. It's not something far away. It's very close.
Thank you very much for a very interesting.
It is because I am old.
Well, I understand I'm a little old myself. So that was a very interesting talk.
Thank you.
I wondered if we could move in a very different direction, perhaps with another set of sirens, the sirens at the end of Plato's Republic, in the myth of Earth, where there is one on each planet, and as the whole goes around, and they sing in harmony to kind of like bind the universe together. And certainly not pluriphony. I wondered what sort of thoughts you had on that.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I mentioned this in my book on the voice, for more than one voice. And this is a way, a wonderful fantasy of Plato, of course, he was a genius, but a way of capturing this anomalous female vocal performance, something beyond our reach, something mythical beyond. And the genius of Plato engaged and was successful in capturing the voices, each voice, and organizing these in the harmony, which means the universe, the cosmos harmony, and producing a music which is perfect, inaudible, not audible. And this is interesting again, something inaudible. It could be interesting also for young scholars. I mean, there are many texts about these, many traditions. To ponder, to do a research on how the audible and the inaudible is linked to the myth of the sirens, so to the figures of the sirens. Because at the end, we don't know if somebody has ever listened to the siren song. According to Kafka, Ulysses lied, because they didn't sing, but he pretended that they had sung. So the audible and the inaudible, the perfect music that could be audible or not, harmonic or not harmonic, I think is a great issue, what you mentioned. It's a great issue.
We can thank Professor Cavarero.